It's like So good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. We're in Geneva, so good afternoon. We're just hit the 12:30 mark in Geneva. I would like to welcome you to the Srinath Ramphal Center's panel at the WTO Public Forum entitled SIDS, Small Island Developing States, and LDCs, Least Developed Countries, as frontline laboratories for green trade policies. And just to be clear, by green trade, we're actually being quite liberal with our use of that terminology. It's really any sustainable trade policy. So we see that as encompassing green, blue, circular, any of these other trade sustainability type of policies. Let me introduce myself. I'm Jani Vremi. I'm the director of the Srinath Ramphal Center, and I will be the moderator for the panel. But I would like to mention in particular other members of the SRC who have made this panel possible and who are here with us. Adela Lewis, one of our trade researchers, and Russell Campbell, another one of our former trade researchers. And we really had some good fun in putting this panel together, at least conceptualizing it, because we are a center that is based in the Caribbean, and we are, as small island developing states, very much interested in advocacy, research, and training on how the multilateral trading system can work for developing countries, and in particular SIDS. As outlined in the abstract advertising this panel, we believe that effective climate change policy and sustainable policy requires inclusiveness, and in particular, consideration and taking into account of local circumstances and success stories, best practices from all countries, not just the ones we often hear about, so the global north or the larger developing countries. And in spite of that, what we have noticed that in the common narrative, there's very little emphasis on the experiences and perspectives of some of the countries that are on the front line of the climate and sustainability crisis. And they're often excluded from the global conversations. And even when they do have formal status in discussions and negotiations, the narrative about their success stories is often not broadcast in the same amount of emphasis as those from the global north. So the purpose of our panel today, which falls under the theme of inclusive policies for advancing green trade, is to highlight the progress made by SIDS and LDCs in developing their sustainable policies, and explain how that could actually intersect with discussions happening at the WTO and in other fora where rules and policies are actually made. And to assist with that and give really the perspectives from that cohort of countries, a subgroup of countries in the international trade arena, what I think I've assembled here is a wonderful group of policymakers, negotiators, and in certain cases, innovators, when they're thinking creatively about how SIDS can respond to the call for mitigation adaptation in the climate and other types of the crises, the polycrises facing the world now. And let me just be very brief in introducing them, and I will introduce them in the order in which they will present their remarks. Ambassador Toliofa Nela Pepe Tavita Levy. I hope I did not butcher your name, Ambassador. She is the permanent representative of Samoa to the UN and the WTO. Next, we will ask James Mongi to my right. He's the founder of Climate Platform Africa, a public benefit organization focused on really driving economic transformation in Africa through large-scale climate action that builds on the continent's natural resources. Following James, we will hear from Ambassador Usha Dwakar Kanabadi, who is the ambassador and permanent representative of the Republic of Mauritius to the UN, WTO, and other international organizations. And then finally, we will hear from Mr. Rolf Paye, who is the executive secretary of the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention Secretariat, and has served previously as the Seychelles Minister of Environment and Energy. So we really have a very well sort of stocked panel to give us in their own perspectives coming from their countries, and we've asked them to dig deep into the stories of their countries. And then after the first round of overview of some of the stories coming from their countries and communities, we will then briefly look at how that might connect into the multilateral negotiations happening at the WTO and in other places. So I've asked each of them to provide a 5 to 7 minute overview of some of the stories coming out from their countries that we can really use to think about how SIDS and LDCs are responding to the sustainability imperatives. So we'll start first with Ambassador Nella, who will give the Samoan experience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jan, and to the Sridath Ramphal Center for organizing this event and for giving Samoa the opportunity to share Samoa as well as a Pacific perspective. I thought that it'll be best to share some visuals to actually showcase some of the initiatives in Samoa that promote green and blue trade. So bear with me as I'm far from being tech savvy as I move between the slides. Only a few slides. So I can start off with at the national level, that one of the government of Samoa's national priorities is the environment and managing the impacts of climate change. And I've drawn that green living reference from the Pathway for the Development of Samoa 2021 to 2026, where the government aspires to push for more green developments to achieve a green living, where communities, government bodies, and private businesses can learn, practice, and live in an environmental friendly lifestyle. Initiatives such as reuse, carpool, paperless, and eco-friendly products will contribute to reduced waste and increased recycling streams, and in ways that will preserve and conserve our natural resources and habitats. And I'm happy to share some of these initiatives that are being implemented in Samoa. So the first one is the improving performance and reliability of renewable energy power system. We'll call it the IMPRESS. It's a multi-funded initiative led by the Global Environment Facility, the GEF, in collaboration with the governments of Samoa and the private sector. The IMPRESS supports national efforts to achieve 70% renewable energy generation by 2031 and aims to reduce dependency on fossil fuels, lowering carbon emissions, and promoting sustainable energy practices. So some of the projects that have been undertaken under the IMPRESS project are listed there: construction of biomass gasification plants, biogas systems in 5 different communities, the procurement of harvesting equipment for feedstock preparation. There have been school awareness programs on climate change that have been held, installation of solar lights to selected communities, and finally, there also have been procurement of electric vehicles to raise awareness on reliable energy. This project was scheduled to complete this year, but I believe it has been extended up to next year. The government endorsed the waste management regulation in 2018 to manage the plastic pollution in Samoa with a commitment to protect the country's oceans and marine environment. The nationwide ban on single-use plastics, packing bags, and straws came into effect in January 2019. There are exemptions in the case of food security, which includes packaging for goods such as meat, sugar, and cocoa. The waste management regulation also led to the eventual ban of the styrofoam products in February 2021. So while we were locked down for COVID, we also continued to the ban on the importation and use of styrofoams. The slow and progressive plastic ban has allowed businesses and the public to consciously use reusable bags and alternatives as more plastic products will be banned in the future. But despite the ban in place, there is still a sizable portion of plastic use in the community. The informal sectors continue to use plastic bags and styrofoam products at flea markets, fruit and vegetable markets, and with small rural businesses. However, we have also seen that local markets have recently started promoting the use of coconut leaf baskets, as you see there, for shopping instead of plastic bags. I also wanted to make note that at the regional level, there is also an equivalent project being undertaken at the regional level called the Pacific Ocean Litter Project. Another initiative that is being implemented in Samoa is the Plastic Recycling Solution Samoa, or the PRESS, which was an initiative by one Mr. Pedrana. And this project was launched in 2020 with the aim of changing the mindset of people to turn plastic into sustainable source of income. And products that has been innovated under this project includes hair combs, bowls, plates, cups, and rulers for primary school students, as you see there in the photos. And finally, I wanted to spotlight two Samoan businesses that have adopted environmental friendly and sustainable practices in their production processes, namely in the beauty care industry, Maililani Company and Women in Business Development Incorporated. The Maililani Company uses recyclable packaging for their skincare products and offers recyclable refill pouches and bottles for their customers to reduce pollution. All of Maililani's products are handmade with minimum use of electricity and fossil fuels. Whipty, on the other hand, is a leader in organic systems in the Pacific Islands. They currently export coffee and bananas to New Zealand, as well as virgin coconut oil to the UK. Materials used for the end products are sourced from more than 700 organically certified farmers working on 33,000 hectares of land. So those are some of the initiatives that are taking place in Samoa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And as you gave these examples of the initiatives, they're very similar to ones that are actually happening in the Caribbean and in SIDS there. And one of the questions that I probably will have for you in the follow-up is, how do we get some of these sectors and industries to scale in a way that they can become marketable and attractive and branded for the larger market? Because one of the issues is that they're really for either local or regional production. Or what we need is a big influx of, well, we need demand, but we also need an influx of support so that they can actually take, because they're so niche, that they can actually find a niche market overseas and bring the kinds of revenue generation we need for some of the for some of the communities to thrive. And how do the trade rules begin to intersect with that kind of community-based sort of projects and ideas? So thank you so much for that. And talking about scale, I know, James, that you are one of those that keeps speaking about seeing developing countries, least developed countries, as opportunities for bringing in investment that can actually take huge advantage of the huge interest in renewable energy, but not just for the domestic market, but also to meet our climate ambitions, but also to be a source for complete replacement of fossil fuels at that huge, huge, huge scale. So I'm wondering what your perspective is on how we can think creatively about LDCs in Africa, for instance, as opportunities for that kind of move to renewable energy.
Thank you, Genevieve, and thanks to both for convening this and for the work that's been done ahead of this, and really appreciating the example already shared from Samoa. I'll actually make a I'll dive a little bit into a very specific example of what it means to really pursue green growth, if you will, in a way that actually affects people's lives. And maybe it's because it's lunchtime, but I'm going to talk about cooking. Um, some of you will know that the biggest driver of carbon emissions in most African countries is deforestation, by far. It's the biggest chunk of what goes into our NDCs, is how much deforestation we're seeing every year. And the biggest driver of deforestation in most countries is not commercial logging. It's not even necessarily clearing of land for agriculture. It is the search for cooking fuel. So the biggest single chunk of the drivers of deforestation is a search for cooking fuel. In terms of firewood, although mostly firewood that's used in rural areas is used as is deadfall. So it's not really you're cutting down the tree, it's you're walking really long distances to gather firewood. But mainly for charcoal, which is used in cities and towns. And charcoal is an extremely inefficient and unhealthy way to cook, if you think about it. Huge amounts of the energy contained in the biomass you cut down are lost. And then when you cook with charcoal indoors, you've got particulate matter, you've got all manner of health challenges and so on. If you could do one thing that would vastly improve health outcomes for women and children who tend to be in those smoky kitchens together when the cooking is happening, or have to gather the firewood in some cases, if there's one thing you could do that would be good for the climate and good for public health and good for quality of life, it would be addressing cooking. So now with that as our problem statement, let me talk about an interesting case study of a solution. So one of the one company that's operating in Kenya, which is no longer is technically a lower middle income country, very newly graduated, but actually is to all intents and purposes an LDC, is a company called Cocoa Networks. And what they were focused on is the potential to shift consumers, particularly in urban areas, to bioethanol-based cooking. Now, the beauty of bioethanol is, on the one hand, when you burn it, for anyone who pays attention to chemistry, all you get is carbon dioxide and water vapor. It's literally the cleanest burning fuel you can use in cooking. At the same time, it burns with a nice blue flame. So anyone who's looking to feel, there's that aspirational sense when you move to the city, should I move to LPG or something else? It burns with a similar flame. It also is easy to put out when it catches fire, unlike kerosene. You can actually use water to put out ethanol-based fires. And then finally, because it is biogenic in nature, it's not a fossil fuel, it's actually a closed loop, right? So in a sense, it's not adding to emissions. You're taking plant matter and you're burning it again, but you're doing so efficiently. Maybe the last thing I'll say, it's a lot easier to move around than a gas. So this company said, well, bioethanol could be really interesting. And what we'll do is we'll put ATMs in essentially automatic teller machines like you see anywhere, and put them in kiosks near where people live. So because it's an easier to handle liquid, you can actually place this actually in the informal settlements where large numbers of folks in dense urban areas live. And what you then have is a cooking fuel point that's as close to the consumer as the charcoal dealer, as the kerosene dealer. Uptake was tremendous. Customers loved it. The idea that you go in with your little flask and you plug it in and you get exactly the amount of fuel you want, and you may not even need to use cash because your flask has your QR code that's linked to our M-Pesa payment system. All of that made everyone feel like we are now in a very different cooking experience. This is an aspirational good. Not only is it an aspirational good, the stove is cheaper than a charcoal cooker. And the fuel is competitive with charcoal and kerosene. Okay, now you're sitting there saying this has to be too good to be true. What does it take to accomplish this? And the key is in thinking through all of the impacts of something like this and how do you stack them together into a scalable business model. And the first thing to keep in mind is consumers for cooking are extremely price sensitive, right? Try and explain to a mother trying to cook for her children and also buy food for them and also pay school fees that they should pay just a little bit more for a health benefit into the future. That's a really hard conversation to have. You need to meet them where they are, which is make it cost competitive. And the first thing to look at is, all right, what are the other values that's being created here? And so one of the things that cocoa does is it very carefully tracks and credits the avoided emissions from mitigating deforestation to the highest possible standard. Now, this is no longer where we're going to point at that forest and say we're protecting it. It's saying this is how much charcoal was used in this area. If we reduce it by half, this is how much forest by definition is being protected. So you get a big carbon subsidy that goes into lowering the cost of the stoves and the fuel. But there's additional things you can do. If you are really, as a government, trying to address indoor air pollution, trying to address deforestation, trying to address availability of cooking fuel, then it's in your interest for this cooking method to displace others. So let's look at the toll gate taxes on and the tariffs on the importation of cooking stoves. Let's look at the importation of bioethanol to begin with. So that's the first step, is you have this conversation, and this has happened in Rwanda, for example, where they have said, looking at the success in Kenya, that from day one, we are going to allow the fuel to come in at a lower tariff. We are going to allow the stoves to come in at no tariff because we're trying to actually accelerate this, and because the informal economy in which most Africans cook is entirely untaxed. So if you're trying to move them to better solutions, you can't have one taxed and the other untaxed. But then you get to something really interesting. In the process of doing that, national demand for bioethanol, which mostly otherwise used for alcoholic spirits and the like, went from a few million tons to 40 million tons a year. 40 million liters a year. And suddenly you have a defunct and moribund sugar industry saying, wait a second, we might be able to meet this demand because this is now localized anchor demand. And so you're triggering domestic industrialization. And not only that, you're having people thinking, well, ethanol can be made from non-food crop displacing crops in marginal areas. It didn't make sense to look at that when we needed to figure that out and then figure out how to export it. But if we've got this massive locked-in demand, well, maybe we should grow large fields of cassava and yams in places that were otherwise degraded lands to feed into the system. The end result is you have an ecosystem. In Kenya, where this has gotten to its most advanced stage, you've gone from 5,000 households cooking with these bioethanol stoves in 2018 to over 1 million today, adding about 100,000 households a quarter. This is just, it's flying off the shelves as a consumer good. And like I said, translating to about 40 million liters of bioethanol demand, which has in turn underpinned the declaration of the plan to build a 20 million liter rather, bioethanol production plant. Rwanda, looking at this, is now saying, well, in our case, we're going to cut these taxes from the beginning and really lean into getting this going. And the reason I use that example is, on the one hand, it's got all of the aspects of a new kind of Silicon Savannah, evolving Africa picture, right? The ATMs and so on. It's also got very concrete benefits to people in terms of health, in terms of convenience, in terms of just quality of life. And finally, I think at the current rate, with 1 million households, their estimated avoided emissions is between 4 and 5 million tons per year. And remember that that number is growing in that first country and other countries as well. And so it's about saying everywhere where we are seeing these high emissions, low quality of life solutions represents an opportunity for concerted policy interventions to create new markets, improve quality of life, and improve outcomes, while also tapping a much more rigorous carbon standard if we can get to it. Thank you.
Amazing example there. I went thinking you'd go somewhere else with your example, but this is amazing. And I know I've heard a lot about biofuels as alternative sources to deal exactly with the highly polluting charcoal based kind of cooking. But I think what you've managed to demonstrate is how addressing a very particular need in a community has become scalable and even exportable now, as you say, to Rwanda, and how the experience has now filtered into thinking very proactively about how trade policy intersects with that. And that's ultimately what we'll go to in the second part of the questions. And I'm being quite permissive with time because I think we're okay. I don't want to limit too much the presenters in their exposition of the examples. But we will turn eventually to any questions from the panel, but I'm giving the presenters a little bit of license to provide examples from their countries because we don't hear enough of those. So thank you so much for that. Ambassador Kanabadi, I wonder if you had any success stories to tell us about or from Mauritius on green policies that have proven successful or from which we can learn.
Thank you. No, actually, I saw your question and I was wondering, I'm not sure I'm going to be researching all of that. Yes, we have loads of success stories over the years, and I'll give a couple of examples is offhand that I can think of. During COVID, we have this lady who invented masks made of bagasse, totally biodegradable. She's patented it now. I'm waiting to put it on the white or green women, the things that they sort of invent. And that was one. We've had plastic has been banned in Mauritius, so we have alternatives to that. We have the usual stories like Nella pointed to, I think that has gone there. We produce bioethanol as well using sugarcane, but it's used more for industry than for cooking. Cooking, luckily, we don't have the problem of charcoal and fossil fuels. And I apologize, James, for not greeting you. Arrival. But I wanted to answer your question differently is that you have this problem of climate change and you have the problem of small islands that need to find alternatives to whatever is increasing the carbon footprint. The reality is that we represent less than 1%, right, of global house gas emissions. The reality is that we are 65 million people only, and that we are not the first target of people who should be taking green initiatives. We should be simply assisted with green initiatives. And those countries that are producing much more, and we know the top 3 and the top 4 perhaps on a per capita basis, are the ones who need to apply green technologies to themselves first and also give it to us freely. Because we want to make things better. Even the little amount that we're doing, the 1%, if we can cut that back, it's fine. But don't come and impose rules and regulations on us that don't allow us to be able to trade properly and then to find the money to be able to take the initiatives that we want to take. But I wanted to share with you one story of how we can have a disaster suddenly on our footsteps. And this happened to Mauritius in July 2020, when everybody was in the middle of COVID. And we had this ship registered in Panama, owned by the Japanese company that with ballast floundered on our reefs. We won't talk about the details of it because there was an investigation on in July 2020. It stayed there for quite some time, 25th of July till about 4th of August, when suddenly the weather was very bad. So how to cope with that? This was full of fuel oil. You were worried that something could happen and the ship could crack up and this would spell a disaster, but you had no means to know how to cope with this. And you had never faced this kind of situation before. And that's the case for many small islands. Eventually, what had to happen happened. 4th of August, things started getting bad. Bad weather stopped people from going in. Then we found the salvage master coming, trying to make things right. It didn't quite work out. On the 9th of July, we had a leak. And of course, the people got together. Authorities, yes, but the people got together to create what we call, what appelle ça chez les saucissons? With, big sausage-like booms, creating booms. And there it was very interesting. The booms were supposed to mop up the oil. And the women in Mauritius, a lot of them went and cut their hair. And they put it in the boom because hair are great absorbers of oil. Don't even try to put your thing in the sink. It doesn't work. But I mean, the booms worked. And I had offers like my friend from Australia saying, I can send you 15 tons of hair. Do you want it? But I said to myself, it's quite amazing, isn't it? When you're in the middle of a problem, people just come together and rally. We asked countries, we had like 93 countries responding, saying, we can send you experts. We had experts coming, we had people coming. we didn't quite know how to manage this. And we said, IMO, you know what, you come and take care of this. And UNCTAD, but eventually it turned out to be a good story because the Japanese realized suddenly the ship was under their company and they moved very fast. Spoke to the ambassador Yamazaki here, and then they were suddenly all over the place until today. JICA continues to help to clean this. Now, everything, if you go back to Mauritius now, there's no sign whatsoever. But at that time, it hit the mangroves, hit, the water in the region. And I can tell you, I've lived opposite that crush since my childhood because it's my uncle's bungalow. We spent every weekend there. You take a kayak and you go out in the lagoon, and it's the most beautiful thing in the world. You see the reefs, you see the fish, it's like Pacific. You like enjoy your book, hold an umbrella and read your book. It's a great feeling. And then suddenly my uncle was like, it was black, it was awful. And we have natural reserves. So things that are unexpected are also things we need to focus on. Why do I say this? We can take all the initiatives we want. We discovered then that many islands hadn't signed up on an insurance that they need to sign up to get compensation. So you have an oil spill and you haven't signed up to that kind of a scheme. It was on the UNCTAD, I can't remember the name, but then you don't even have compensation. So how do you cope with this? And increasingly, I find across the world, there are going to be increasingly this kind of incident that suddenly brings marine pollution or what have you to your doorsteps. And there's not much you can do. So how do we alert people? How do we make things better? I think should also be the focus of our attention beyond everything else. Sorry, I didn't want to be too long. And I love James' story because I'll tell him another one about Kenya later.
So Ambassador, what you've managed to do very craftily is reframe almost the question. And I always like what you do, which is to question the basis of the basis of the question that I asked, which is, how do we think about SIDS and responding to this call for mitigation, and really turning that on its head and saying, well, we're actually not the problem. And there's another way of thinking about it, which is let them take the lead in terms of the technologies, and through some kind of more fair returning of the technology, we can actually take that, but we don't need to be the first movers. I think that's interesting. And I guess I also want to think about it as how do we take advantage and becoming competitive in these technologies and these goods and services as well, because the ideas that you generated for me is we often think of this in terms of goods, but we are large ocean states, as we know in the SIDS. So the idea is that we are really advancing even in terms of the pedagogy, how we train and teach engineers and marine biologists, etc. They are steps ahead sometimes in thinking about the marine ecosystems. And so they could be deployed to areas like this when there are these kinds of spills, etc. So thinking also about how do we take advantage of our own resources and train our people to be world-class in responding to these sorts of things, and how does the trade environment actually and rules assist us moving to these areas of disaster, for instance. And then the idea also about the need, and a lot of the ideas coming from where's the need arising, and the creativity, the examples you gave of the ladies using their hair. In Barbados, we have these awful, in the Caribbean, sargassum seaweed that are making our beaches ugly. And it's not just an ugly a case of aesthetics, it's also the fish. It's unsightly, but it also is terrible for our fish and marine life. And one of our young people have come up with the idea of using that sargassum seaweed for fertilizer, and using that also as another way of taking advantage of a very negative situation. So I guess it also breeds creative juices in us to think also outside the box, because we are beset by some of these problems of climate change. So thank you for that reframing and thinking about creativity in the solutions. And then finally over to you, Rolf. I don't know from which angle you're going to take it. I have a feeling you're going to combine your plastics with your blue economy experience, but over to you. Seychelles.
Thank you very much, Jan. And of course, I'm going to surprise you. And I just wanted to really congratulate Her Excellency from Mauritius for taking a twist on this, because we always talk about the benefits of trade, but we don't talk about the cost of trade. And SIDS really feel that cost of trade, because the Indian Ocean is a major shipping lane for oil. which serves the whole oil. As you know, Saudi Arabia and all the other countries, this is where the oil is transported through Suez Canal, down through South Africa and everything. So you can imagine the millions of tons of oil crossing there. And this is the cost of trade that is not being factored in for small island states that face this issue from oil pollution. And it's also the cost of trade in plastics also. The amount of plastics we have washed up on the islands, for example, where there's no one living there. Where did the plastics come from? It's from the large consumers where there's a lack of control. Again, the cost of consumerism, the cost of trade is often ignored in this whole debate. So thank you, Ambassador, for bringing a twist to this whole thing. And of course, I will come up with 3 examples. One from Seychelles, one from the work that I do, and of course, bring the context of trade into the thinking that's been happening over this week. And I just wanted to also congratulate my ambassador here as well from Samoa, when you showed the photo with the coconut leaves there making the bags. Now in Seychelles, we call it a kapatia. And as late as the 1970s, if you were getting married as a man and you didn't know how to make this bag, you will not get married. So they were, no, you're serious. You had to know how to make this. I have no idea how to make it. I didn't get married in the 70s. But you know what I mean? It was an important part of the household. It was an important part of living, an important part of life, because we used to carry fish, carry everything in there. So if you were to betroth that young woman, you had to show that you. So this was your certificate as a man to be able to take care of the house and the family. So you understand what I'm trying to say? It's going back to this real grassroots that needs to redefine, and of course bring in the element of culture into the way we do things, because culturally 50 years ago I never went to the shop without a bag, and today I sometimes forget to bring a bag because I've got used to this easy way of life where everything is kind of done for you, so you take it for granted. And this is of course the problem of plastics, right? And everything is packed, everything is convenience. I'm coming to my thing now. I'm going to bring 3 examples to you today. The first one is on tourism innovation. And I'm glad you raised that, Jan, because sometimes you focus on products. But one of the biggest incomes and contribution to GDP in SIDS is tourism. Everybody flocks to the islands, whether it's winter or summer or whatever, to enjoy the beach and everything. And we in Seychelles, we've been pushing for sustainability in the tourism industry. And we've seen that it can be done by large chains and small resorts. Let's not call them resorts, but 10 rooms, small hotels as well. And I want to use the example of water there, because water is a very interesting concept, because even here, Evian is next door. They ship this in plastic and water bottles, in glass and plastic bottles all over the world. And if you go to any hotel, you ask for a bottle of water, you get Evian, and then also you get the Italian ones, right? Exactly. Now, the problems with this, and please don't get me wrong, I'm not against bottled water or the water industry, but I'm just showing you the implications of this. First one is the carbon footprint of shipping those around the world. They are heavy. Water is heavy, guys. A liter of water is a kilo. Plus the bottle, plus the plastic problem. Okay, that's 3. And of course, a tourist going to Seychelles wants to enjoy, because he comes to Europe, wants to enjoy Evian. Because the local water, what is that? Okay. Again, a cultural perception there. And we've worked, for example, with Hilton, who has a big imprint in Seychelles, and that's a global chain. And they've managed to shift away from bottled water using very simple techniques. First, there's a technology that's been invented many years now, which is available. You can even have it for your home, is air to water conversion. It uses very little energy. It converts humidity in the air, and most islands have high humidity, like 50, 60, 70%, and converts it using low energy. So this is something that has been introduced in that hotel. And they brought in the labeled bottles with nice branding with the hotel. And every day they refill it. They refill it and put it in the rooms. They've completely eliminated. Now, for trade, we've gone away. We've removed, the government is not collecting any taxes, because when you export an Evian bottle to Seychelles, the government puts 30% tax on it for obvious reasons. And then you have WTO and the agreement telling you, no, you should not be competing against that. You have to remove the tax. But at the end of the day, the world loses, I think, if the tourism industry cannot transform using this such a basic technology, which can run on solar, which also creates job, because it's one job for one person to man the bottling and everything. It's very basic technology. So I just wanted to share that with you and look at all the angles with just a simple. And of course, when we finish with the bottle in Seychelles, who wants to take it back to Evian? No one. Where does it end up? In the sea, in the ocean, landfills? There's no landfill. Landfills are full in the islands. Tell me, your landfills are full. I visit landfills all my life. I never seen an empty landfill on an island, because you have got no land first, and you have to nobody wants a landfill next to them. And I know countries who have reclaimed lagoons because they run out of space to put in landfill. So I just wanted to give you the different perspectives. And there's a cost of the pollution, the cost of managing the landfill, the cost of collecting the waste, which is eliminated by the adoption of this very simple technology. Now you might tell me, oh, this is well and good for a big hotel. Now I visited a small hotel of my friend who's retired. She's got 10 rooms. And I said, what do you do for water? He said, I rent one of these machines. It produces for me 20 liters a day, and I bottle it and I put it in the 10 rooms. So the technology is not really only for the big chains, but also for the small hotels as well. And I just wanted to share with you that innovation. So that's my first one in the tourism sector. And of course, there's many innovations that can be done in the tourism services that can replace the huge burden that countries face in the tourism. The second one, financial innovations. And there I come with the blue economy. And there's a lot of work being done. And of course, it's challenging, but also very opportunistic. We in Seychelles, we came up with this development of a debt for nature swap, because we had quite a bit of debt. Obviously, a lot of countries have a lot of debt, and we said, look, why don't we follow the model which has been done on land, forests, for conservation of forests, for elimination or reduction of debt. So Seychelles said, why can't we save a certain area of our oceans, protected areas, marine protected areas, conservation of resources in exchange for debt? And of course, that went 6-8 years ago through the World Bank. Seychelles actually achieved the first sovereign blue bond. And today, the Galapagos is going to be very soon approving the largest blue bond ever on our planet, close to $1 billion or less, between 500 million and $1 billion of a blue bond, which can be used. Now, what does that generate? It generates resources for conservation, so more investment in conservation, but also generates resources for us to look at how we can develop innovative technologies for sustainable exploitation of the fisheries, for example. How do we manage the fisheries in a sustainable way? Dolphin-free nets, turtle protection, with fishing. How do we do research, managing quotas, managing the resources that islands have been bequeathed with? How do you create jobs in the blue economy? All these are potential areas which such a bond can fund. And Seychelles has been using that to fund those areas. And just last week, Seychelles and Mauritius in the joint management zone, and that's a unique, also another unique framework, is Seychelles and Mauritius got together to manage an extended part of the continental shelf, okay, which is shared by both countries because, of course, as islands, we have large, we are large ocean states, as they say. And they are starting now to look at how to sustainably manage these areas, and they are technically a bit of areas beyond national jurisdiction. So there is a huge area of innovations there when you start thinking about such financial innovations. within the seed sector. So that's it for this one. And the next one, of course, is the final one is on circularity. And I think this has been a topic being talked about here today. And I just want to bring the example from the Pacific, for example, in terms of the memorandum of understanding you signed with Schwa Shipping, which means that when they bring products to you in the Pacific, they pick up your waste and take it back for recycling and recovery. Because, as you know, seeds don't have the capacity to recycle and to recover some of these very complex products that we use, like mobile phones, batteries, and whatnot. And the Pacific Islands have been really successful in negotiating with this shipping company so that they can use the empty containers that are going back. Now, this is the reality. When things are going, because the trade deficit is really high in small island states, because they import more than they produce, because they don't have land to produce like massive amounts of agricultural output. They don't have natural resources. And if they're exporting fish, that goes into refrigerated containers. So in fact, the normal containers go back empty. And they've worked out a memorandum of understanding with this shipping company to ship back waste that they cannot handle, especially inorganic waste like plastic, electronic waste, and all this, that can then go to appropriate recycling centers, for example, in New Zealand, Japan, Australia, in those places where those things can be recycled. So again, using trade as an opportunity to deal with waste. And for me, that is part of the circular discussion, because then we are thinking of the whole picture, and we are protecting the island environment. We are increasing the quality of health, because otherwise these would have been dumped, as you all know, because there's no place in the backyards or in the ocean, in the reefs, where they can contaminate, of course, the natural resources here. So one of the important areas of discussion, of course, is the extended producer responsibilities. To what extent does big producers for their product want? And that brings me back to Evian, but also we can talk about Samsung, we can talk about Apple, we can talk about the computer manufacturers. And I'm saying that because I don't want to single out any particular company, obviously, but just to show you that there is potential for us to look at how we can use trade to really, make a circular economy work. So to finish off, I just wanted to say that for this to happen, in my experience, you need to engage the local people. I mentioned culture, but also the universities need to be engaged, because these are innovations that need to be thought through, to have startups. You have the role of government, who need to provide the right incentives, the right policy frameworks. You need the role of the private sector, has been seen here, tourism, the hotels, shipping, in the trade, and of course in the finance innovations, the fishing industry, and definitely the role of the civil society. So you need to bring all these building blocks together. And when you think of trade, then trade is not about just importing and exporting. Trade is addressing the big picture of sustainable development, in my view. And once you think in that way, talking about the reshaping here, then you start seeing things differently, and start then looking at how you can innovate to bring wealth to the islands, also create jobs, and achieving, of course, the sustainable development goals. I've on purpose not talked about climate change. That's another topic I can talk about for a week, but but I think I just wanted to point out to these little hidden gems that we sometimes forget about, and I think we need to work on and focus on. Thank you.
No, Ralph, that was brilliant. And it is exactly all of the panelists why we thought this was such an important panel to convene, because just even the flavor, the accents, the perspectives, the culture is coming out in the way even we express ourselves, the attachment we have to the sea, and to the people that we represent is, I think, very distinct when you come from these types of communities. And I really wanted that to kind of be on display in very much the way each of you brought your perspectives to bear on this panel. And I agree with you that it is an all of society approach, Rolf, in bringing together all of the different constituencies and stakeholders that have to make this work at a domestic level primarily, but also to think about creatively how we build the kinds of sectors so that they are exportable, but starting really with the needs we have, because all of the major mechanisms and trade rules and the trade measures that have come out, even in the EU, when we think about CBAM, is because of a very specific need these countries have that they've now exported to the rest of the world. In the case of CBAM, well, it's loss of competitiveness because of actions that they are taking to promote their own EU deal. And now CBAM has become sort of the thing that everyone is discussing. And I think the more we tell the stories about the things of interest to us, the more you can catalyze and get discussions going around these things. So I want to turn in the second half, and I will invite questions because we've had a very, very lengthy first part of this panel. But in my view, and I really want to sort of, ask you to be creative here. When we talk about SIDS and LDCs in the WTO, in the negotiations, I find it's always, as you say, trying to catch up, or always trying to be exceptions that are taken into account. So even in the context, as I said, of CBAM, it's, well, what do we do with small island developing states and LDCs in order for them to be exempt? Or when we even think about the subcategory of new states under the Doha declaration, we are thinking about SVEs and coming up with an agenda for SVEs that is not creating its own new category of states. But I don't know that we're always getting the narrative right in terms of making these offensive agendas. And one of the areas is blue economy. I know, Ambassador, you have a lot of experience in discussing the importance of the blue economy, but even as a topic that is of huge offensive interest to developing countries, it's still dealt with very sectorally. And we're beginning to see UNCTAD and the UN bringing it, and even our regional organizations bringing it as a self-standing topic, but it hasn't yet become a topic of discussion at the WTO as an integrated economy. All of that is a big kind of lead into the next question, which is, how do we bring these issues front and center for discussion at the WTO in a way that is not marginal, but it is a way that reflects the fact that we are some of the smaller members, but our interests are just as important in getting traction in these discussions. And I wonder if there are any personal stories or even more generalizable perspectives that you may have to share that you think would be really important as we think about how to bring some of these issues front and center in this house. I'll give the ambassadors, and well, you have an answer, but I wonder if there are any questions from the audience that can actually supplement or take the panel in a different direction before I pass the floor again to the ambassadors and to our founder here. Anyone? Okay, so let me go to James first, and then Ambassador, you next, and then Rolf, and then you, Ambassador.
So I did want to pick up on exactly that point of opportunity, because I do think we need to frame our thinking at this critical moment in history with an understanding that every single industrial sector is about to undergo over the next 20 to 30 years a fundamental shift. It has to. And you're already seeing it in a few. And I will tell you that anyone who says, well, that's not really going to happen, needs to ask an auto industry executive from 2015 if they could have imagined what happened to them based on one small fancy electric car company in California, what happened to them over the course of 7 years. And the transition in the auto industry, now think about it in every other sector, right? Driven in part by climate, but also just driven by technology. And just to be clear, what I mean is even 5 years ago, people were saying, well, electric mobility is 10, 15, 20 years away. Now show me a major automobile manufacturer in the world who isn't saying that they'll be phasing out internal combustion engines within the next 10 to 15 years. And yet our discussion as LDCs and large ocean, large ocean states, LOC, LOSs, and LOSs continues to be about, please don't force us to adapt to take on the future because we haven't had a chance to benefit from the past. You don't win by dragging yourself back in the past. The winning country in the energy transition that went before this wasn't the one that said we should be allowed to continue to use whale oil to light our streets. It was whichever one embraced fossil fuels quickest, once it was clear that that's where it was going. Now, as fossil fuels end or die off, there's a danger of us repeating that same mistake and saying, oh, why are we being forced to adopt new technologies when we haven't exploited the old ones? And yet, interestingly, the one thing these particular set of countries have in common is they're uniquely well suited to the technologies of the future. I'll give you one example. Take a solar energy system in Zanzibar versus one in Germany. Now, Germany has something like 30 gigawatts of solar installed. But remember, the same solar system would be 14 times more able to produce baseload energy. So reliable baseload energy from solar is 14 times more available in Zanzibar, and I'm picking an island on purpose, from the same amount of capital investment as it is in Germany. Now, what that means is that for the same amount of money, you get 14 times more reliable energy in many island states. That sounds to me like a comparative and competitive advantage. That sounds to me like it's actually cheaper to electrify everything renewably in a small island state. That might almost tell me that maybe per capita, there's more electricity available in a small island state than elsewhere. And if I'm thinking about where to put energy demanding activity that actually has a small labor force need, I might want to move some of it to these very sunny places that I already go to as a tourist, because actually the conditions there are quite favorable. And so how do we take that thinking and then apply it to very practical spaces to begin with, such as how much fossil fuel, the fossil fuels that are in those boats that are coming to our islands are coming to power our energy. If we don't need them, then we don't take that risk, right? If we electrify our fleets, we are also avoiding the cost. Every year, that trade deficit in almost every country is predominantly driven by the cost of importing fossil fuel. That's the biggest chunk. Go solar and electric, it's gone. So where are the policies that are really leaning into the fact that these new technologies are actually playing into our strengths as countries in the tropics? And we should be embracing them, not just as late adopters. You people do them and then we'll figure them out once you've taken them, but as early adopters and indeed even as innovators at the cutting edge, because some things will make economic sense in our parts of the world before they make sense anywhere else. And maybe the concrete example I'll give is, again, Kenya, not an island state, but some similar dynamics. Our first green hydrogen project in Kenya, powered by geothermal, but you could as easily do it with solar, is not for export. It's for green ammonia to make fertilizer. It's basically saying we should have an entirely closed loop of green fertilizer manufacture on the continent that does not require any fossil fuels because we have so much renewable energy. Think about that applied to everything else we're importing and saying we have the energy, we have some of the raw materials of the future. How are we among the first to deploy them rather than among the last? Because usually when you're among the last, someone else is making money off of you. When you're among the first, you're exporting a skill and a capability well into the future.
Thank you so much, James, for that. Talk about more food for thought. And I'm so conscious of the comments made by Ambassador Kanabadi to think about also framing this as an opportunity for us to actually become first movers on some of these. We will get caught up with the issues of finance. And I know that's the big elephant in the room. How do we bring these technologies? And is there still a delta of a benefit for investors who can get more sunlight? Yes, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, in the Indian Oceans. But how do you then take, I guess, the product and bring it back to markets closer to them? Is the cost of bringing it back the hydrogen cell, or is that cost still higher? Because another problem of SIDS, which is slightly different maybe from the example of Africa and Kenya, is they're distant from major markets. So transportation is a huge issue, but also scale. So Kenya is smack dab in the middle of the continent, itself has a huge domestic population, can export maybe to another destination of huge numbers, has a lot of natural labor forces that can help to bring down some of these costs. But SIDS have their own peculiarities. So again, things for us to think of, but just beginning to think about the policies and trade that will help to defray some of these natural disadvantages and really highlight the natural competitive advantages that you mentioned. So Ambassador, I wonder if you've had some time to think about how do we represent these interests in trade context at the WTO in ways that can really take advantage of some of the things we're discussing here and really make the trade system negotiations work for us?
Well, thank you very much. I don't know where to start or end. The discussion has been very lively, and I'm learning new things. A couple of things that have come to mind is that there's so many initiatives that are happening, and that they could be mirrored in some of the small and developing states, scaling them up. So probably some of these things that we can consider. But I have this last slide there, and I'll leave it there for everybody. But food for thought. I think the impact of COVID and the closures, the pause that we had from COVID was a really important and eye-opening season. And we saw nature, what we have done to nature being restored in that time. And I think it was a realization that some of the things that we've been talking at the WTO began to take its priority space. So that slide there, as I was mulling through the question posed, and the thing is, how can we insert our interest in the multilateral negotiations if we are not here? And I can take the example of Samoa, just establishing its mission here in Geneva just over a year. Prior to that, we were not privy to the negotiations, or we were not part of the negotiations and the discussions here in Geneva. So be present. An observation this week when I came to the WTO, it was buzzing. And I think we should have more of these conversations. And how can we bring these conversations to the negotiating tables where our negotiators are sitting in some of these discussions, and I'm thinking, okay, a lot of the things that are being said in this room do not apply to my country. So it's up to us who are present here to try and bring those onto the table. And the pictures, I like visuals. I like to look at things. And I think the end story is to remove the things that are bad and promote things that are good. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Perfect way to bring it back home. Thank you, Ambassador. Be present. So important to our parts of the world. And thank you for your presence. Rolf and then Ambassador, and we see if there are any questions, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Thank you, Jan. I'm building upon what the ambassador has said, being present. If we look at experience we've learned from AOCIS, for example, which is the Islands of Island States, which negotiates at the climate change. And here, I mean, the two countries are champions. Ambassador Slade, who was chair of AOCIS, Ambassador Kunchul was also chair of the AOCIS. So there's a lot of experience in the SIDS in navigating the challenges of these negotiations. Now, yes, trade is maybe a species on its own, but I think, recapping from what I've been saying before, we need to change the narrative. It's not about how much fish I can export, how much sugar I can export, how much this. It's how can I do this by creating my niche. Now, why, you know, I live in Europe and I live in France. Champagne is a special region. And Chardonnay is a special appellation. But what's in seeds are, you know, at the beck and call of big, you know, producers or buyers. And so our products, which are most of the time organic, are most of the time done using sustainable practices, are not given that kind of value that is given, which pushes us then towards the end of the spectrum, which is mass production, mass export. You know, the Seychelles fish, you don't find it anywhere. You have to go to really expensive upmarket shops to find Seychelles fish. But it's hard to get there, but it can be done. So many companies, you know, and I always liken small island states to be like small companies, you know. General Electric is 125,000 staff plus. That's okay, not a Mauritius small island state, but certainly a Seychelles one, and certainly many of the Pacific Islands and some of the Caribbean islands as well. Which means that, you know, these companies started small, but they defined their niche. They built, they knew what they wanted, and they focused on what they wanted. And of course, I use that in a very loose way, but I think us SIDS need to organize ourselves in WTO. We need to have a proper SIDS grouping here, not only to represent our countries, but those that are not there as well, because a lot of the SIDS are not there, I know, and because of the high cost, and also because of the low capacity in the SIDS to bring them there. So we have expertise in those two SIDS sitting next to me, because I worked with both of them. Excellent people who've now retired, but we do have the experience. Second point is the leakages. We think, again, in selling more, but we also think of in using more, because that's the predominant drive for trade, is you have to use more. And believe me, I faced it in Seychelles when we're trying to develop the energy transition policy towards more renewable energy. The colleagues running the petroleum, they said the government will get less taxes. Our generators will produce less electricity because it's economies of scale. We have to make sure that we use the generators to the maximum so that we recover the investment that we've made in generators. Again, this kind of thinking, where we are leaking out the precious foreign direct investment and foreign exchange that the islands are earning from tourism, for example, we are spending it on fossil fuels, instead of making investments that create wealth in the country in situ, that builds then the resilience for climate change, builds the resilience for adaptation. All this is linked. And when your economy is directed in only one way, consume, and then the government collects more taxes, then of course you are bound to end up with a deficit, and you're bound to end up in a political situation that is difficult to come out. The final point, and this is all examples that I've faced in my life, which really drives me to see that we need to change the thinking. Small islands, and in particular the Seychelles, at one point thought, why invest in agriculture when we can buy cheaply elsewhere and import it into the country? And indeed it was cheap. We could import from Dubai, import from everywhere, cheap products. And I like your example about cassava and millet. Because you get cheap wheat, so why would you grow cassava? And the problem of food availability in Africa now is because we've shifted people from agriculture and started to buy wheat from the rest of the world, because they're producing it cheaper, and we don't invest in agriculture. We don't invest in agriculture training. We don't invest in agriculture research. We don't invest in sustainable farming. So at the end of the day, again, we're back to this net consuming society. So I will stop here, but I just wanted to be provocative when I end my presentation here. Is the thinking has to change in the trade arena, and I think the SIDS can bring this change in the thinking to WTO. Thank you.
excellent comments again from my panel. Ambassador, before I really give you the closing sort of seat here, I really wanted to know if there were any questions, because we have 3 minutes to go and I realize I haven't seen if there's any questions or comments. Yes, please.
Good morning, all. Well, good afternoon now. I'm in the UK mission out here in Geneva. I work on trade and development. And it's been very enlightening having very specific examples of different countries and how they've kind of developed, green industries. And I think throughout the week, there's been lots of very blue sky thinking. There's lots of really positive ideas, but ultimately kind of when we gather next week and most people have gone home, the conversations probably won't be as ambitious. And I guess kind of picking up on the point that Rolf, that you've just made there, is it feels as though there's a real need for action kind of sooner rather than later. And there's very specific things that LDCs face, there's very specific things that SIDS face. And so the question is kind of how do we address those more specifically? It feels as though you need a much more targeted ability to change the rules to address those specific things, but under the current framework of the WTO, there is no way of addressing specific problems that SIDS face. And, it's pretty difficult with LDCs as well. So where there was earlier the reference of the kind of the real opportunity of creating renewable green technologies and how much more efficient that would be in some of these LDCs than it is in places like Germany. So yeah, my question is ultimately when for the rest of the year we're discussing these things, how can we try and frame it to be more pragmatic, to be able to have more tailored responses to the needs of SIDS and LDCs? Thank you.
Yeah, well, Ambassador, we'll give everyone 1 minute to close, but Ambassador, you have more than a minute to answer that one.
I'm not sure I can answer your question, but I'll make 2 comments. One is what stops the SIDS from bringing anything that they want under the small economies discussion and saying, this is my problem, I want to discuss it. What stops the SIDS from bringing things under the discussion of the COVID pandemic and saying, this is what I faced? And what stops the SIDS from bringing a paper to agriculture, which we have in the past from 1996 as Mauritius, to say that there's a specific situation for small island developing states in the growth of commodities like banana and sugar when we were under attack. We're no longer under attack. We feel we'll be taken care of. We become service industries. So we're not, how do I say it, mobilized to take these forward. But we can look at the tremendous job being done by the OECS countries in e-commerce and in other negotiations, because they are focused and they have the capacity. I don't think it's only Joel and Ambassador Colin, but I think it's also a full backup like the West Indies University, helping them to get where they need to get. So the fault is ours, not bringing attention to ourselves. But when you wear different lenses, sometimes you feel that you will not be listened to. And I won't tell a joke, and Rolf won't mind, he's my cousin, but they're a little bit smaller than Mauritius. That's why I'm saying that. There's this well-known joke, and I often use it, and I'll tell you why. The Egyptian president was receiving a delegation from the Seychelles. And the Egyptian president walked out to receive delegation. He had 400 people at the back. Then he saw the Seychelles president, James, coming in and said, there were 6 people with him. So he looked at him and said, where are the others? And President James said, well, they're at home. And he said, oh, how many are there? 60,000 at the time. 60,000. Oh, why didn't you bring them all? Just imagine, that's the perspective, the difference of perspective that you have. So your problem about sugar and a few tons of sugar, Dominica, all of the Caribbean, all their problems about bananas, nobody could fathom out that all that you were doing was removing food from a few poor countries that had little production capacity for other things and putting it not in the mouth of other countries who are also developing countries, but in the mouth of TNCs, because they are the ones who won the case, not anybody else. Otherwise, they wouldn't have lost the case. So, you look at a country like St. Lucia, 150,000 people, 2 Nobel Prizes. Today, what do they have left? It's not easy. You can't always rely on tourism. It's not easy. So we can do that. But even as we sit here, and I just want to add this last comment. Even as I sit here, I was looking in my phone desperately to find the submission of Mauritius to what? Did we even notice this week that the Vanuatu claim at the ICJ was coming up for discussion? Whether the advisory opinion they're asking about compensation for climate change, will that be taken up? The first question is whether it is admissible. And Mauritius is very clear. It is very much admissible. And it uses all the UNCLOS. I'll send it's on the website of the ICJ. I suggest you read it, because this is what we should be concerned about. Not reparations under Paris Agreement is one thing. This is life-changing. The advisory opinion to be given by the ICJ on this will make a world of difference for SIDS. How we bring it to the WTO, I'll let you find the solutions and tell me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I know we're out of time, but I do want to give each of my panelists, if they wanted half a minute to conclude with any sort of high level thoughts on any of the question or anything else that occurred to them during this last hour and 15 minutes.
So I think my closing point is going to be scale and distance are real challenges for small island developing states. It's a given, but they're challenges no matter what. I think the point is a carbon sensitive economy of the future almost invariably will argue for doing more in those places than less. It'll argue for importing less because everything you bring is causing emissions, just as everything you send out is causing emissions. And it might argue for sending out a little bit more because you have energy and you're currently exporting raw stuff. So in general, thinking through where is it that on margin, everything that we do to expand opportunity in these places is generally aligned with a green agenda. Making more bags from renewable material is part of a green agenda, but it also creates jobs. So how do we frame the developmental challenge and the climate challenge as being aligned with each other and in line with our comparative advantage as tropical states more broadly and as small island states in particular is one of the challenges that I'd leave all of us with.
Excellent.
Just to say thanks and to encourage you to continue to have these exchange. Otherwise, country situations are not brought out to the fore, especially here at the WTO once a year that we get to have this. And I think if I could share one final point, I come back to mindsets. Yes, Ambassador Kanabani, nothing stops us from bringing proposals to the WTO, but it must be targeted and organized, and we must persuade those that oppose the proposals of the situations in our country. So a bit of persuasion to change that mindset. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan. I won't call it a reset. I will call it a rebalancing. With globalization, we sent everything in one direction, which means that, open borders, open trade, increased competitiveness. But we saw today, it's not only the countries that are in deficit, the planet is in deficit because of the pressures we put on our resources, environment. The evidence is there. We see that the planet is in deficit. We see the rich countries are in deficit. I mean, they own trillions. I mean, the largest economy owns trillions in money. So because they're consuming more than actually, because it's based upon the economy and the stability of the economy. But at the end of the day, we need to correct this. So this element needs to come into the WTO negotiations and trade. Just to answer your question, you cannot just have a one-way street because it is not working. It is creating the problem for the planet and the problem for the economies. And that's why we have such, collapse of economies, collapse, and eventually leading to the collapse of our planet. So this sad thinking needs to change. Thank you.
So thank you so much, panelists, ambassadors, Ambassador Nella, Ambassador Executive Director Rolf, Ambassador Kanabadi, and James, for what I thought was one of the best panels, if I may say so myself, I've heard for the public forum, specific but nonetheless really big ideas for us to take forward for inclusiveness, but also just because it makes sense more generally for everyone. Some of the ideas that came out here will definitely find their way in some of the things we write. Let me thank again Adila Russell, all of those who helped with organizing behind the scenes, to the interpreters, as well as for making this one of the few live streamed events, and to the audience for sticking it out with us 5 minutes over time. So thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of the forum. Thank you.